FTX CEO John J accused Sam Bankman-Fried of commingling funds and mismanaging his multi-billion-dollar crypto exchange without governance, security controls, or proper risk management before the House Financial Services Committee yesterday. And sitting in that room was our next guest, U.S. House Representative Ritchie Torres, Democrat in New York. Congressman, thank you for joining us. And what a incredible hearing to watch. Any key takeaways that you took away from it?
Look, the detail is shocking, but the hearing, as well as the criminal charges, confirm what we've long known, that Sam Bankman-Fried essentially perpetrated a Ponzi scheme of fraud against 1 million creditors. During the hearing, I shared an anecdote that I thought was quite revealing about the failure of corporate governance at FTX. That in the bankruptcy filing, it noted that decisions about the disbursement of funds were made in an online chat with personalized emojis. And so at one point in the hearing, I said that FTX had the corporate governance of a college fraternity. It would be laughable were it not so serious.
All right, so on November 7th, Sam Bankman-Fried tweeted that FTX was fine, and then he deleted that tweet. And during the hearing, you asked John J if Sam Bankman-Fried was lying. Let's have a listen to his answer.
I don't want to give the dignity to his comments. He also said that he had $10 billion to invest in the company that day. So
let me ask the question differently. At that time, when he sent out the tweet, leading the public to believe that we have enough to cover all client holdings, did FTX actually have enough liquidity, enough assets to cover their liabilities?
Absolutely not.
So that statement was false.
Yes.
So when you hear from Sam Bankman-Fried, he actually says he thought it was true at the time, but then realized it probably wasn't, and that's why he deleted the tweet. And so there's almost this plausible deniability here that, it was just a mistake. And there seems to be this line between mistake versus malfeasance. What are your thoughts on this whole defense that Sam Bankman-Fried has been putting on?
Well, first, I'm inclined to believe that he's a pathological liar, and there's evidence to suggest as much. But second, he has made contradictory statements, because on November 6th, he actually acknowledged that there was a problem. But then on November 7th, proceeded to send out a tweet claiming that FTX has enough assets to cover all liabilities, leading the public to believe that there was no problem. So he misled the public. He lied, because at no point after the collapse or even before then did FTX have a sufficient liquidity to redeem all the customer deposits.
Congressman Torres, great to have you on. What was your take on Ray as the new CEO of FTX? Not just your take, but other fellow members of Congress. When the session was over, you guys are sitting by the coffee machine. I don't know what you guys are doing in the cloakroom there, but and you had this CEO brought in to clean up this mess. What was the general impression of him?
My impression is he spoke carefully. He was guarded with what he said and how he said it. He was careful not to weigh in on crypto writ large or even suggest regulatory reforms. He was insistent on staying on his lane and focused on uncovering what went wrong at FTX, which is a position that I respect. I think that is his bailiwick. So we thought, and we appreciated his bluntness. I mean, he has spoken quite bluntly about the collapse of FTX, describing it as far worse than what he observed firsthand in Enron. So we thought his testimony was valuable, but it was also focused on staying on his lane.
You brought up that he didn't want to opine on regulatory issues. Nonetheless, he was hammered a little bit on where he stood, whether or not the SEC or CFTC should be regulating these kind of exchanges, and he didn't want to give his opinion. Do you think that this changes Congress now to act faster than it did before, to finally set who should be in charge, if it's one of those two agencies or some third group or organization that should be monitoring spot exchanges. Has this created an impetus to get it done as fast as possible?
Well, in my view, that we have a responsibility to act, to translate the lessons learned from the FTX collapse into public policies that will prevent future fraud, future Ponzi schemes. Look, for me, it's not an either-or proposition, it's both. The CFTC should regulate digital assets that resemble commodities like Bitcoin, and the SEC should regulate digital assets that resemble securities. But regardless of who's the regulator, I think these are some of the principles that have to be put in place. First, there has to be greater transparency around the balance sheets of crypto exchanges. A crypto exchange should be required to prove both its assets and liabilities, and to prove that its assets are sufficiently liquid so that customers can redeem their deposits immediately on a one-to-one basis. Second, there has to be protection and segregation of customer funds. A crypto exchange must be explicitly prohibited from lending, leveraging, or commingling funds. And third, there needs to be a separation of powers and a segregation of duties. A trading firm should not have its own exchange, and an exchange should not have its own trading firm. So regardless of who's the regulator, those are the regulations that should be put in place to prevent a repeat of FTX.
Now, we just showed a document of your letter to the government accountability office. And I just wanted to know, what kind of legislation do you think is needed out of this collapse, this FTX collapse? And how much of it is it due to old-fashioned fraud versus crypto innovation?
Oh, I see it as more a function of fraud than crypto innovation. Demonizing a whole industry based on the fraudulence of one actor is fundamentally unfair. Sam Bankman-Fried is not representative of crypto finance any more than Bernie Madoff is representative of conventional finance. So I think we have to be careful not to paint the crypto industry with a broad brush. I did send a letter to the Government Accountability Office asking it to conduct an independent review of the SEC. Mr. Gensler has taken the position that he is the principal regulator of crypto. So if he had the authority to regulate crypto, there's a logical follow-up question. Why did you fail to prevent the largest crypto Ponzi scheme in American history? The burden falls on Congress to pass laws, but once the necessary laws are in place, the burden falls on regulators to apply those laws, to expose wrongdoing and protect the public. And when it comes to FTX, Gary Gensler has failed catastrophically as a regulator.
So back in March, mid-March, you and 7 other Congress members sent a letter to Gensler, to the SEC, about its inquiries into some of these exchanges, and there was some question about whether or not and how the SEC should approach it. So is that a change now from your opinions back then? Can you clarify? Because obviously there's some criticism that, hey, the SEC was doing its job back in March, and that there might have been some heat from members of Congress who subsequently, it seems that many have received funding from, or at least the contributions from FTX. I know you've given away those funds to charities, but nonetheless, there's this view that the group that mailed Gensler back in March kind of told him to back off, or made it seem like they wanted him to back off a little bit and question his ability to do this. And now there's this, as you're saying, that, well, maybe the SEC should have been doing its job more. So how do you address this?
The letter in March raises concerns about the effectiveness of Gary Gensler as a regulator, and those concerns have been borne out by the FTX collapse, which happened on Gensler's watch and for which he is singularly responsible. So I don't see it as a change. I see it as a continuation of concerns that I've had about Mr. Gensler from day one.
Okay. Another question we want to touch on is campaign finance violations. SBF has been hit by charges to that degree. Did you receive any campaign donations from Sam Bankman-Fried, FTX, and what's the proper route to do with them? Some lawmakers are donating it to charities, but should it be returned to creditors?
I honestly don't know. This is uncharted territory for me. We did receive an unsolicited contribution from Mr. Bankman-Fried, which has been donated to charity, but I'm in no position to advise how other elected officials should handle these contributions. It's worth noting that I had no real relationship with Mr. Bankman-Fried, never had a one-on-one meeting with him regarding crypto, never had a phone call with him, never exchanged a text with him. His main act when he was lobbying in DC was advocating for, I think it's the Digital Commodities Consumer Protection Act. And I was never a sponsor of that bill. I was never a supporter of the bill. So my ties to him are minimal. We did receive an unsolicited contribution, which I returned immediately upon the findings of wrongdoing.
Congressman Torres, I'm sorry, I'm going to return a little bit to that March letter, because when reading it, and by the way, it was also signed by a couple of other people, friends of our show, actually, Warren Davidson and Tom Emmer, who frequent here as well. But the question that they brought up with Gensler seems to be, as I'm reading it right now, it says, basically, we have questions regarding this, basically the SEC's utilization of the Division of Enforcement Division of Examination Authorities to obtain information on cryptocurrency and blockchain firms. And then it goes on to ask about, it mentions that there is limited statutory mandated jurisdiction. And later on, you bring up, the letter brings up the Paperwork Reduction Act, and whether or not this is, this is an issue here. Do you think that this basically has changed, though, the view of members of Congress, even the rather friendly to crypto members of Congress? Has this changed now? Do you think like a letter like that would have gone out now compared to back then? Do you think that there's an attitude change, at least not just with the 8 who have signed this letter, but in general in Congress, that there's more of a willingness to say, hey, you know what, we'll let Gensler, pick what's best here?
So the letter was a critique of regulation by enforcement rather than regulation by rulemaking. Mr. Gensler has been in office for 2 years, and he has not enacted a single rule, not one rule, that would bring greater accountability and transparency to the industry. Notice that the letter makes no mention at all of FTX. So the notion of blaming a technical, non-binding letter is patently absurd. And the letter acknowledges that the SEC has the authority to request information from crypto firms, but must do so in a manner that complies with federal law, including the Paperwork Reduction Act. And then the letter presents a series of questions. What are the compliance costs? What's the cost-benefit analysis? What is the response times? That's an exercise of our oversight function. My job as a legislator is to ask questions about the processes and policies of an agency. So I just don't quite understand the criticism. There's a difference between asking about policies and practices and interfering with a particular investigation into a particular company. The first is an exercise of congressional oversight. The latter would be a breach of ethics. And blurring the line between the two, frankly, does a disservice to the truth and represents defamation of character against the 8 of us.